Okay, so you want to, this worksheet, section 1.5, part 1, you want to solve by factoring. So the first thing we got to do is put this in standard form. So we're going to say 6x squared minus x minus 12 equals 0. And then we're going to factor this. So first of all, look for a GCF that, other than 1. GCF is 1. There's nothing else you can factor out, so we can just go ahead and factor this as two binomials. And then the possibilities for 6x squared are 6x and 1x, 3x and 2x. Let's just try for right now 3x and 2x and see if that's going to work. Possibilities for 12 are 4 and 3, 2 and 6, 12 and 1. Let's try 4 and 3. Okay, now if you try 4 and 3, remember if you put a 3 here, based on what we discussed last year, if you put a 3 here, that means you could factor out a 3. See, that's a 3 in both of those terms. So you can factor out a 3, which means you could take out a 3 from the beginning, and you couldn't. Same thing here. If you put a 4 here, so put the 3 here, put the 4 here, put the 4 here, that meant you could factor out a 2, which you could not because this term's not divisible by 2. So let's put the 4 here and the 3 there and see if that works. Alright, so I'm just going to go directly to the outer and the inner. So the outer is 9x, the inner is 8x, and see the last sign's negative? That means that these signs in here can be different. So one of these has to be positive, one of these has to be negative. And so since the signs are different, we're just going to subtract those, and notice 9 subtract 8 is 1, and you did want a 1, although it's a negative one that you wanted. So basically what that means is that in order to get a negative 1x, the 9x has to be negative and the 8x has to be positive. So in order for the 9x to be negative, this has to be negative. In order for the 8x to be positive, so for 4 times 2 to be positive 8x, this has to be positive. Alright, so we factored this correctly. Always check though. 3x times 2x is 6x squared, and positive 4 times a negative 3 is a negative 12. The outer is a negative 9x, the inner is a positive 8x, and when I add them up, I get negative x. Now the next step is to use the zero factor property. So when I use the zero factor property, I said each of these factors equal to 0, so I get 3x plus 4 is equal to 0, and then 2x minus 3 is equal to 0. So then notice I went from a quadratic equation to two linear, so I solve these linear equations. And so I get 3x, when I combine like terms, is equal to a negative 4, so that means x is a negative 4 thirds. Over here, when I add 3 to both sides, I get 2x equal 3, which means x is 3 halves. So your solutions are negative 4 thirds, comma, 3 halves. Okay, over here, in the next one, they want you to solve by using the square root property. So to solve using the square root property, I've got to get the algebraic expression squared equal a number. So it's got to be in that form first. So that means that I've got to add 5 to both sides first here. And so I get 3x squared equals, and then a negative 80 and a positive 5 is a negative 75. Then I've got to divide both sides by 3. So when I divide both sides by 3, I get x squared equals a negative 25. So that's where I'm at. Alright, so now, remember the square root property says that if you have, let's say, d squared equal some number, I can take the square root of both sides to get d by itself, but don't forget the plus or minus. So this would be, d would be plus or minus the square root of u. Alright, so over here I have x squared by itself, so now I've got to get x. So now I can take the square root of both sides. So let me go ahead and rewrite this. So you can take the square root of both sides, don't forget the plus or minus. So what you have here, and the x and x squared don't do each other, so what you have here is x equals plus or minus. Now remember, this is the square root of negative 25. So the square root of negative 25 is the square root of a negative 1 times the square root of 25. And the square root of negative 1 is I, and the square root of 25, since 25 is a perfect square, the square root of 25 is I, so you get 5i. So this right here is plus or minus 5i. So those are your two solutions. So plus or minus 5i, or you can say 5i, comma, negative 5i. Sorry. So plus or minus 5i, or you can say 5i, comma, negative 5i. Over here, again, you want to use the square root property. So it's already in the form right here where you want some algebraic expression squared equal a number. So it's already in that form. So basically, you're just going to take the square root of both sides, just like this. Don't forget the plus or minus, but you do have to simplify the square root of 8. So this right here becomes the square and the square root into each other. So you get 2x minus 3 equal plus or minus. Now let's simplify the square root of 8. So a perfect square that goes into 8, and we use the largest, is 4. So that's 4 times 2. So the square root of 4 times the square root of 2. And the square root of 4 is 2. So you get 2 square root of 2. So this is plus or minus 2 square root of 2. Now remember, so my solution, see how this is a square root of 2, so that's irrational, so my solution could be irrational. When the solution is irrational, then just write it in the compact form. So basically you're going to add 3 to both sides. Combine like terms, you're going to get 2x equal 3 plus or minus 2 square root of 2. And then you can divide both sides by 2. And so you're going to get 2 divided by 2 is 1, so you get x equal 3 plus or minus 2 square root of 2 all over 2. Now don't make the mistake and reduce these 2's unless you write it as 3 halves plus or minus 2 over 2 square root of 2. Alright, so don't make the mistake and divide out these 2's and say the answer is 3 plus or minus square root of 2. It's not. So you can leave your answer like this because 3, 2, and 2, they all have just the GCF as being 1. So you're done there. So that's 3 plus or minus 2 square root of 2 over 2. Or you can split it apart. You can say 3 plus 2 square root of 2 over 2, comma 3 minus 2 square root of 2 over 2. Okay? Alright, then the next one, number 4, they want you to use quadratic formula. So remember, quadratic formula is the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And so, first of all, when using quadratic formula, this has to be in standard form. It already is, so you need 0 on that side. It's in descending order. So you got to determine a, b, and c. So a is a coefficient of x squared, so that's 1. b is a coefficient of x, so that's negative 4. And c is the constant, which is a positive 5. And then basically just plug your numbers back into this formula. So we get x equal the opposite of b. Well, if b is a negative 4, the opposite of a negative 4 is a positive 4. Plus or minus the square root of, okay, b, put all those in parentheses, that's a negative 4 squared, minus 4 times a is 1, times c, which is 5, all over 2 times a, which is 1. And now simplifying the radicand, remember this b squared minus 4ac, that's a discriminant, so let's go ahead and just call it that. So simplifying the discriminant, I'm going to get 4 plus or minus the square root of negative 4 times itself is 16. A negative 4 times 1 times 5 is 20. So minus 20. All over 2 times 1 is 2. So I get 4 plus or minus the square root of 16 minus 20 is a negative 4 all over 2. So I get 4 plus or minus, now you remember the square root of a negative 4 is the square root of a negative 1 times the square root of 4. So that's I times 2, which is 2i. So that's 4 plus or minus 2i divided by 2. Now, don't leave it like this because you can notice that 4, 2, and 2, they all have 2 in common. So basically, you're going to say that's 4 over 2 plus or minus 2i over 2, which is 4 over 2 is 2, plus or minus 2 over 2 is 1, so just get I. So there's your answer there. Or you can split it apart. You can say 2 plus I, comma, 2 minus I. Alright, now over here, again, we use quadratic formula, but it's not in standard form, so you got to bring the constant 3 to the other side and make sure it's in descending order. So 2x squared minus 4x minus 3 equals 0. And then, in order to use this quadratic formula, let's determine a, b, and c. So a is 2, b is a negative 4, that's a coefficient of x, and c is your constant, which is a negative 3. So you've got to make sure that all these a, b, and c's are correct, that all these values are correct. Alright, now, just plug in everything back into the quadratic formula. So this says I take the opposite of b. Well, if b is a negative 4, the opposite of negative 4 is positive 4, plus or minus the square root of negative 4 squared, minus 4 times a is 2, times c, which is negative 3, all over 2 times a, which is 2. So I get 4 plus or minus the square root of. Negative 4 times itself is 16. A negative 4 times 2, well, first of all, a negative times a positive times a negative is a positive. So that'll be a plus symbol here. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 3 is 24. All over 4. So I get 4 plus or minus the square root of. 16 plus 24 is going to be 40. 4. Now we got to simplify the square root of 40. So let's think about what the square root of 40 is. So I got to use the largest perfect square. It's always easy to use the largest perfect square that goes into 40. So the largest perfect square that goes into 40 is 4. So that's going to be 4 times 10. And then writing it as square root of 4 times the square root of 10, this becomes 2 square root of 10. So that's what this becomes right here. So this is going to be 4 plus or minus 2 square root of 10 divided by 4. Alright, now there's several ways you can do this. You can notice that 4, 2, and 4, they all have 2 in common. So basically what that means is this. So I'm going to go ahead and do that here. So what that means is this, that they're all divisible by 2. So that means 2 into 4 is 2, 2 into 2 is 1, 2 into 4 is 2. So I can write the answer as 2 plus or minus 1 squared root of 10 squared root of 10 all over 2. So I can write that as the answer, as a solution. The other thing you could have done is this. You could have said, just writing it as 2 fractions, you could have said 4 over 4 plus or minus 2 squared root of 10 over 4, and then reduce. So 4 over 4 is 1, plus or minus over here, 2 into 2 is 1, 2 into 4 is 2, so that would be 1 times square root of 10 square root of 10 divided by 2. So that's another, let me write this as R, so you can also write it as 1 plus or minus square root of 10 divided by 2. And then the other way you can do it is, see this right here, you can write as 2 separate solutions if you want to. So it'd be 2 plus the square root of 10 over 2, comma, 2 minus the square root of 10 over 2. Or you can use this one, 1 plus the square root of 10 over 2. Just make sure that 1's not being divided by 2, because remember 4 over 4 is 1. So the only part that's being divided by 2 is this one right here, comma, and then 1 minus the square root of 10 divided by 2. Alright, so those are different ways of writing the answer. But make sure, especially for my math lab, that you reduce as much as possible. Okay, so that's going to take care of this worksheet in section 1.5, part 1.